Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're getting into the absolute, undeniable armored tanks of the Mesozoic era. We're counting down 10 mind-blowing facts about Ankylosaurus. We're going to break down their timeline, their incredibly bizarre anatomy, and the evolutionary quirks that made them just so fascinating. You know, these animals were a whole lot more than just those slow-moving background herbivores you see in the movies. They were literally walking fortresses shaped by millions of years of intense prehistoric arms races.
Okay, let's dive into this. Long before paleontologists were carefully out there dusting off fossils, human beings were actually interacting with ankylosaur remains and weaving them straight into their cultures. Just think for a second about how massive and completely otherworldly these bones must have looked to people who had absolutely zero concept of a dinosaur. I mean, stumbling upon giant, stony armor plates embedded in the earth naturally inspired some serious awe and terror. Down in the American Southwest, the Navajo told stories of a terrifying armored creation myth monster named Yetso, and his flint-like scales were very likely inspired by these fossilized plates scattered across the desert. Meanwhile, all the way up in Canada, the Piegan people found massive ancient bones along the Red Deer River, and they actually left deep offerings to a legendary creature they revered as the grandfather of the buffalo.
So that brings us right to fact number 1. To really grasp how deeply these creatures captivated early humans, we can look at the Delaware people of what is now New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Native Americans recognized this inherent, almost magical power in these fossils centuries before Western science even had a name for them. The Delaware had this very specific ritual involving the bones. According to tradition, if you took a piece of ancient bones we now know for a fact belonged to dinosaurs like Ankylosaurs, placed it in a clay spoon with tobacco, and smoked it, you'd be granted a wish. Things like hunting success or good health. It just goes to show, these creatures commanded immense respect long before they ever ended up in a museum display.
All right, moving from ancient mythology right into the dawn of modern science, here is fact number 2.
While isolated fossils were definitely found earlier, it was actually Gideon Mantell who officially named the very first ankylosaur, Ankylosaurus, back in 1833 after quarry workers uncovered a partial skeleton in England. But here's the truly wild part. Even though this was one of the very first dinosaurs ever named, and it actually helped Richard Owen coin the famous term Dinosauria in 1842, the actual group name Ankylosauria wouldn't even exist for nearly a century. It wasn't until 1923 that Henry Fairfield Osborn formally coined the term. Just imagine that. For almost 100 years, scientists knew about these heavy, spiky animals, but they suffered from such a severe identity crisis that they were just lazily lumped in as strange, flattened relatives of stegosaurs.
And that massive, decades-long identity crisis leads us perfectly into fact number 3.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real turning point in our modern understanding. Walter P. Coombs' groundbreaking 1978 paper. This represents the exact moment in scientific history where the puzzle was finally solved. He formally and definitively divided Ankylosauria into the two main families that paleontologists still recognize today, bringing some much-needed order to what was a totally chaotic family tree.
If we look at the distinct skull shapes and his mapping of their evolutionary lineage, you can see how Coombs figured it out. He basically looked at all the reasonably complete specimens available at the time and realized, hey, there's a major, undeniable split here. And it was based on profound differences in almost every single part of their skeletons, right from their snouts all the way down to their tails.
So he split them into Ankylosauridae and Nodosauridae. Ankylosaurids had those famous heavy tail clubs and wide triangular skulls that were perfectly suited for grazing on low, broad vegetation. Nodosaurids, on the flip side, lacked the tail clubs completely. They actually followed a much more conservative evolutionary path, which just means they retained a lot of features from their older ancestors. They sported narrower snouts for more selective feeding and massive spikes jutting right out of their shoulders. It was just a massive leap forward in sorting out who was who.
But, you know, our understanding of that family tree has grown a ton since 1978. Let's hit fact number 4.
Recently, a completely new branch has been added to the tree, Parankylosaura. These are the armored oddities of the southern hemisphere. As the ancient supercontinent slowly broke apart over millions of years, these southern dinosaurs became totally isolated. So during the Cretaceous period, while the famous ankylosaurs roamed the northern continents of Laurasia, these guys lived on the southern landmass of Gondwana, in places we now call South America, Antarctica, and Australia. Genera like Stegosaurus and Kunbarasaurus were forced down a completely different, much weirder evolutionary path. They were generally smaller, running about 1.5 to 4 meters long, and they kept a lot of primitive traits. We're talking relatively long legs and slender feet, which is completely unlike the slow, lumbering shapes of their northern cousins.
And their differences definitely weren't just in their feet. Fact 5 looks at their absolute most terrifying feature. The most crucial point about Ankylosaurus, like Stegosaurus, is that they didn't have that standard bony ball at the end of their tail. Instead, starting right after the 14th tail vertebra, they developed a weapon called a maquahuitl. Named after the brutal Mesoamerican wooden club lined with razor-sharp obsidian blades, this dinosaur weapon was made of a frond-like pattern of flat, funnel-shaped osteoderms arranged outward on both sides of the tail. It was, essentially, a prehistoric bony buzzsaw. In practice, a swift swing of this flat, bladed tail wouldn't just bruise an attacking predator, it would cause absolutely devastating slashing damage to the legs of any theropod foolish enough to sneak up from behind.
Speaking of tail weapons, that brings us to fact number 6, and honestly, one of the greatest evolutionary mysteries of the entire dinosaur world.
So think about this for a second. How exactly do you evolve a massive, incredibly heavy knot of dense bone at the very end of a long tail without completely snapping your own spine every time you swing it, right? It's a serious biomechanical puzzle, and it had paleontologists scratching their heads for decades.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the fossil record reveals it happened in very specific steps, thanks to some absolutely fascinating research by paleontologist Victoria Arbour. Way back in the older Jurassic period, these early dinosaurs just had standard, flexible tails. But by the early Cretaceous, they developed the handle, stiff, interlocking, fused vertebrae that acted exactly like the rigid wooden shaft of an axe. It wasn't until millions of years later, in the late Cretaceous, that the heavy osteoderm knob actually showed up at the tip. They had to evolve that stiff handle first to support the tremendous weight. Without that rigid support structure, the pure momentum of swinging a heavy bone club would have literally torn their own tail muscles to shreds or dislocated their vertebrae.
Evolution really is a step-by-step process, but sometimes it produces something truly weird. Here's fact 7.
Meet Spicomelus. This is the very first ankylosaur ever discovered in Africa, and it possessed extreme armor unlike anything else on the fossil record. While most ankylosaurs had osteoderms embedded within their skin, which, allowed for a tiny bit of flex and movement, Spicomelus had massive spikes fused directly to its skeletal bone. This is extreme. Fusing spikes right to the skeleton means this animal completely traded off mobility for absolute, unyielding, rigid defense. Crucially, it also represents the oldest known occurrence of a dedicated tail weapon within Ankylosauria, which proves these animals were heavily arming themselves extremely early in their evolutionary timeline.
Fact 8 takes us even deeper into their incredibly bizarre structural anatomy. As ankylosaurs adapted to strict, incredibly heavy quadrupedal movement, their internal skeletons radically changed. They actually lost a specific muscle attachment point on their thigh bones called the fourth trochanter. Now, this was a critical attachment for standing upright and running in the early ancestors. So, by losing it, they were entirely committing to a slow, tank-like existence. To protect their core, they evolved a complex pelvic shield, a heavily reinforced fused sheet of bone stretching completely over the hips. And despite what some early paleontologists thought about them using claws for digging, they actually evolved wide, hoof-like nails on their feet. These were designed entirely to carry and distribute their massive, heavily armored weight without sinking.
Fact 9 reveals a hidden survival mechanism tucked right inside their heads.
Now, what's really interesting here is what modern CT scans reveal about the skull interior. Ankylosaurs had incredibly complex, twisted, looped nasal sinuses divided by vertical midline septums. You might be wondering, why on earth would a dinosaur need a nasal cavity that looks like a crazy straw? Well, it functioned as a biological, built-in air conditioning unit. The convoluted passages supported this extensive network of blood vessels that allowed for rapid heat exchange and vital water conservation. If you were a walking tank entirely covered in thick bone and thick leathery skin, you can't easily lose body heat. These looped noses literally kept their brains cool and their bodies hydrated, which was absolutely vital for species like Pinacosaurus that had to survive the scorching, super arid conditions of the ancient Gobi Desert.
And finally, we arrive at fact 10, the climax of our armored countdown. Ankylosaurs were absolute masters of survival. They successfully dominated the globe, from the freezing northern reaches of Laurasia all the way down to the isolated southern tips of Gondwana. They evolved bone-shattering heavy tail clubs with interlocking handles, razor-like slashing macroheddles, impenetrable pelvic shields seamlessly fused to their spines, and even internal air conditioning units right in their snouts to conquer harsh, unforgiving climates. They were, by every single metric, an evolutionary triumph of defense over offense, which leaves us with one incredibly provocative question to ponder. If that asteroid hadn't hit 66 million years ago and wiped the slate clean, what completely bizarre heavy-duty weapons would the Ankylosaurs have evolved next? Thank you for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep exploring the incredible history beneath our feet, and I'll see you next time.